Traveling with non-biological children. What will happen if I enter the United States with relatives who are under the age of 18 and not my biological children? Family separation. Immigration only allows children to enter and stay together with an adult who is their biological parent or legal guardian. When a child crosses the border without their mother or father, immigration considers them to be an unaccompanied child, which means that they are a child traveling alone. Even if you are related to the child, for example as an aunt, grandmother, adult sibling, etc., and have spent a lot of time caring for the child and have documents to prove it, it is unlikely that this will be sufficient for immigration. Immigration will still consider them to be an unaccompanied child. What is an unaccompanied child? According to the U.S. law, if a child is crossing the border without their parents or legal guardian, the U.S. government will consider them an unaccompanied child, which means the government is responsible for them and must ensure no one mistreats them. Because of this, the process at the border for an unaccompanied child is different from the process for adults. When a child and their relative who is not their parent or legal guardian present themselves to immigration, an official will look over their documents, realize that the child is not present with their parents, and then they will separate the child from that relative. What does legal custody mean? The U.S. government only accepts that an adult has legal custody of a child if the adult is the child's biological parent or if the adult has been granted custody of the child through a legal process in the home country and has documentation. Proving that someone has legal custody of a child requires documentation from the government in the home country, such as documents from a court, that recognizes the adult as the parent or legal guardian of the child. A signed letter of permission by the parents will almost never be sufficient to prove legal custody to the U.S. government and prevent child separation. It is important to remember that even when there is documentation of legal custody, there will always be the possibility that children can be separated from any adult who is not on their birth certificate. What happens after immigration separates the child? Once a child is identified as an unaccompanied child, immigration will send this information to another U.S. governmental department, the Office of Reunification for Refugees, ORR, that will care for the child. The ORR is not a part of the U.S. immigration because immigration does not have permission to care for unaccompanied children. Immigration will ask for a space or bed for the child in a shelter inside the United States. The child will stay with immigration at the border for up to a maximum of 3 days before being sent to one of these shelters. During this time, they can stay by themselves or with other unaccompanied children. It is possible that their relatives can leave immigration before the child leaves and begin traveling to wherever their sponsor lives in the U.S. After staying at immigration, the child will go to the ORR shelter where there will be space reserved for them. If there is more than one child, like a group of brothers, ORR should send all of them together to the same shelter when possible. What happens at the ORR shelter? The ORR shelters are not like shelters in Mexico. ORR shelters are managed by U.S. government agencies and exist specifically for unaccompanied children. In these shelters, everything is free: food, medical care, English classes, etc. Upon arriving, each child will be assigned to a social worker who begins the process of family reunification in order to reunite children with their family inside the U.S. The caseworker will need the telephone number of the person who will receive the child in the U.S. The best person to receive them would be the closest family member they have in the U.S., for example, a parent, aunt or uncle, grandparent, or cousin. In the shelter, it is required that the child be able to communicate with their family, but they will not have access to their own cell phone. The child will have to use the shelter's phone. Children are not allowed to leave ORR shelters without supervision. The shelters do plan supervised group outings with the kids, but if a child attempts to leave the shelter unsupervised, the police will be called and are required to return the child to the shelter. If a parent or guardian needs to contact a child who is in an ORR facility, they can do so by using one of the following phone numbers: the general hotline number which works with phone calls, WhatsApp, and text messages, is 800-203-7001. International numbers for Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico. How long will the process of family reunification take? The time each child spends in a shelter is different for each case, but in the majority of cases, the child leaves the shelter after a couple of weeks to be reunited with their family in the U.S. The child will still have to go to immigration court to fight for their case to stay in the U.S. after being reunified with their family. There are cases where the child has to stay in the shelter for a longer period of time. If the child does not have a close family member that can receive them, the process can take a much longer time while the government verifies that the child's sponsor will treat the child well. For cases where the child is considered more vulnerable, such as if the child has a disability or if the child has suffered abuse, the process can also take longer. Because being separated from family and not knowing how long you will be in a shelter is very challenging, many children report mental health struggles after spending a lot of time in the shelters. In the majority of the cases, the child is able to be reunified with someone. However, it is important to be prepared that it could be a long and difficult process. What will happen if the child doesn't have family members in the U.S.? If a child does not have family in the U.S., there are other options for the child. They will remain in the shelter system for a much longer time, and an attorney will review their immigration case and give them advice on their options. Even though the process for children who aren't traveling with their biological parents was designed with the intention to keep children safe, it can often be a very traumatic and hard process for these children to go through. If it is possible for children to enter the U.S. with their biological parents or legal guardian, that is usually the best option. Children who are traveling alone do not have to go through the same process as adults or families traveling with their biological children. Unaccompanied children are not required to sign onto a list or wait for a significant amount of time at the border, and should be allowed to cross when they present themselves to U.S. immigration officials at a port of entry. However, many parts of this process are extremely dangerous for children traveling alone. Kidnapping and trafficking rates for children at the border are extremely high, and although they are not supposed to, the Mexican government can and sometimes will deport unaccompanied children back to their home country.